Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, Paul Rader. Today, I'm going to talk about voter turnout. It is a critical part, after all, of what makes our system of government function and stay solvent. However, compared to most other countries with legitimate systems of voting, not like Venezuela or something like that, and even with those that have compulsory voting, where you can get fined or jailed if you don't vote, the U.S. ranks pretty low in voter turnout, regardless of any of those other things. But regardless of other countries, what makes U.S. voter turnout tick? What makes it go higher or lower? Kind of like that game in Price is Right. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. So, that's to start off with the three main ways we measure voter turnout. Yes, there are three basic ways. So, depending on where you go, you might get one or the other. So, three basic ways. One is you can do participating voters divided by voting age population. So, participating voters divided by anybody who is 18 or older. So, that's what you need to be a registered voter. Or you could do participating voters divided by voting eligible population, because not everybody who's over 18 is actually eligible. For example, they may be in jail or they may be an ex-felon, but they haven't had their voting rights restored, and that's been a bit of a hot topic, I suppose, in recent years for certain states. And then you have the one that I was just talking about with participating voters divided by registered voters. Now, obviously, whichever method you use is going to change the percentage of voter turnout. So, largest population is the voting age population, because it's anybody that's over 18. Medium sized population there is voting eligible population, because not every one of those 18-year-olds is eligible. And then the smallest population would be registered voters, because not everybody who's eligible to vote is registered to vote. And so you might have what's like 75% uh, turnout if you do it by registered voters, but then it might turn into something like 60 if it's voting eligible, and then 50% if it's voting age population. That's just random numbers off the top of my head, but that's just to uh, demonstrate exactly how the usage of those different populations can make voter turnout differ. Now, what instances would you want to use one versus the other? So, a few examples you might have there. A campaigner is a lot of times going to focus on registered voters, because they're the ones that can vote, and that campaigner is trying to get them to vote. Although they may also want to get people who are voting eligible as well, trying to get them registered to vote so that they will vote for whoever it is that they're campaigning for. Barack Obama back in 2008 was very effective at getting people who were voting eligible but were not registered to vote, getting them registered to vote and then voting for his campaign. Very effective at that. An activist who wants to increase civic participation, they may focus on the voting eligible population, because they are the ones who can get registered to vote, and in order to increase civic participation, they are going to try to get those voting eligible people to vote. Although just because you get them registered to vote doesn't mean that they will actually vote. And then you also might have an activist who wants to make changes to voter eligibility laws, like we were talking about with restoration of voting rights to felons. So they may focus on the voting age population, because they're trying to find who of those people are not eligible to vote and in some way make them eligible to vote. Now, as for historical levels of voter turnout, it's if you go back into early US history, when we become an independent nation, or even before we become an independent nation, those turnout rates are hard to accurately portray, because lots of info is either non-existent, or it's incomplete, or it's suspect. Back then, there wasn't as much of an emphasis on keeping all these numbers accurate like how we do now, and not even necessarily not having an emphasis on having accurate information, just the capacity to keep that accurate. Obviously, didn't have computer databases back in the 1800s to help keep all this data in one place. And then you also have to consider the expansion of voting rights to different demographics too, which we'll get into in a little bit. But for best turnout estimates available based on voting eligible population, so VEP for short, that's that median population between the voting age population and registered voter population in terms of how big that group is. And this is according to the US Elect Project, which is actually run by a former grad school professor of mine, Dr. McDonald. We had a major dip in turnout, at least according to these numbers, the best numbers that we have available. There was a major dip in turnout in the 1810s. It skyrocketed in the 1820s and 1830s. And then from the 1840s through the 1890s was the height, the zenith of voter turnout, at least again, based on the numbers that we have. Got a lot of it in that 70 to 80% range. Then in the early 1920s, even a little bit before the Great Depression, it went a little bit below 50%. And then since then, it's been roughly mid or low 50s to mid 60s. But 2020 saw the highest turnout based on voting eligible population in the past roughly a century. So it was in that high 60s category. But there's also a wide disparity in turnout across the states for at least the past 50 years, which is a more accurate numbers that we have. The 60s, 70s, from that point on, it's been a lot more accurate the numbers we have. These numbers are now based on voting age population. Some states that have ranked highly in turnout since 1976 is Minnesota, which was first place 9 out of the last 12 presidential elections across all states. In the other 3, though, it was second place, so it's always up there. Maine was first place when Minnesota wasn't. Iowa has also tended to have pretty high rates of voter turnout. On the flip side, states that have lower turnout that are lower in turnout since 1976 is Texas. Hawaii was last place in 6 of the last 12 presidential elections. Nevada often ranks low as well. BC. And so you see, it's not necessarily a red state versus blue state thing. Some red states are pretty high in voter turnout. More blue leaning states are high in voting turnout, but then you also have some red and blue states that are lower in voting turnout. Now, as for changes to which voters can participate over time, even in the early days of the U.S. as an independent nation, you've probably heard how back in the very early days of the United States as an independent nation, black voters or minority voters in general weren't allowed to vote. Women weren't allowed to vote. It was the minimum voting age was not 18 back then. So, but even in the early days of of us as an independent nation, being a white male wasn't necessarily enough. You needed to have property. Property rights were they meant everything back then. So even as a white male, you weren't necessarily granted voting rights. Now, obviously, they got voting rights first before several of these other groups. It wasn't until the 13th Amendment in 1865 was ratified that we had voting rights regardless of race. 19th Amendment in 1920, when it was ratified in 1920, voting rights for women were then granted. The 26th Amendment in 1971 was what lowered the voting age to 18 years old across the board, though some states actually allowed 18-year-olds to vote before that point. But that's when it became across the board where it was 18 years old for everybody. And then in 1993, you had not a constitutional amendment, but you had an act by Congress, the National Voter Registration Act in 1993, also called the Motor Voter Act, because it greatly expanded methods for people to get registered to vote, but particularly if people applied for or renewed their driver's license. But that has not, however, necessarily led to more participation in elections. Just because people get registered more easily doesn't mean that they're going to vote. Some of them weren't planning on voting anyways, but it did make it easier for people to get registered to vote, and some of those people did capitalize on that. Now, as for demographics that are correlated with higher turnout, it's typically whiter, higher income, more educated, older. One that might come as a surprise to some people is that since 1980, proportion of eligible female voters that participated in presidential elections has exceeded the proportion of eligible male voters. So females are voting at higher rates than males. And for midterms, this has been the case since 1986. And the gap persists when you break it down to black voters, Hispanic voters, white non Hispanic voters. So it's been about 40 plus years since women have consistently voted at higher rates than men have. Now, let's break it down into different categories of different kinds of elections. And there's a bunch of different factors that influence turnout regardless of demographics. So I'm going to break them up into these various categories and talk about why turnout dips or rises within these categories. And some of these reasons can overlap across categories. And by turnout, I don't just necessarily mean that they're actually going to the polls. I also mean participation in contests on the same ballot, not just whether a voter shows up to the polls. So, for example, presidential and U.S. Senate contests, can be on the same ballot, but I consider the presidential contest getting more turnout because more people are casting a vote on there than U.S. Senate, and that goes into something we call ballot drop off, which I will talk about towards the end. So, the first category, we'll talk about federal versus state versus local levels of government. And typically, those federal offices are going to get more turnout than state, and then local gets the least out of those three. So, federal being president and Congress, because those are the federal level offices we can actually vote on. We don't vote on cabinet, for example, or federal judges. State level, you've got things like governor, other state executives such as attorney general, secretary of state, assuming that you can vote on them. Not every state allows you to vote on those executives, state representatives, state senators, local level. Then we're talking about local judges, county commissioners, city councilors, that sort of thing. And then turnout within those groups can also vary. So, governor is going to get more turnouts, more voters participating than other state level offices, such as state senator or state representative. Uh, but the turnout dips for these state and especially local levels because, well, for one, these are lesser known offices than the federal level. And that's especially the case for local level. These county commissioners or city councilors, whatever local level office that we're talking about, they get less media coverage. It's a lot harder to find information on them. There's fewer campaign advertisements. And also, people think that these federal offices, especially the president, impact and have more control over more things than they actually do. They sometimes, for example, want the president or a U.S. senator or a U.S. House representative to do something about a local issue that they do not have any authority over. It's within the purview of these local level offices. And a lot of people just do not care about these state level or especially local level offices, partly because they think that the federal offices do more than they actually do, or they just don't want to spend the time to research, or they don't know where to research information on these candidates. Can be all sorts of other things. But generally speaking, federal level, followed by state, followed by local level in terms of higher turnout, lower turnout, even lower turnout. So the next category, turnout levels in primaries versus general elections. General elections are pretty much always going to get higher turnout than primaries. You might get certain situations such as if, for example, if it's a closed primary and only one party is running, say two Republicans and nobody else. So the primary will be what actually decides the election there. And then obviously they won't have a general election, but those are relatively there are relatively few cases that you're pretty much always going to get more turnout in a general election than a primary. And some of the reasons for that is, like I said, there's some states that have closed primaries for certain offices, and that also limits what non-party voters can vote on. So if a voter is not affiliated with a party and it's a closed primary state, those non-party voters cannot vote in those elections. They can only vote in primaries for offices that are nonpartisan, which might be school board, for example. Most school boards are nonpartisan. Two, many voters don't care about primaries, or they just want to let other people decide who the general election candidates are going to be, and they don't want to have to worry about researching these primaries because these primaries research often takes more effort because they have to differentiate between candidates of the same party, and there are more people to research. Now, obviously, being a Democrat versus a Republican is not going to give you, they're not going to be different on every single issue and whatever else is going on. But when you have that Republican label or you have that Democrat label or you even have a certain third party label, it gives you a general sense of what those candidates stand for. But if you have multiple candidates with the same party banner, you don't have those easy, what we call heuristics, those mental shortcuts where you'd say, okay, they're a Republican, so they tend to support this. Okay, they're a Democrat, so they tend to support this. You don't obviously have that in, for example, a closed primary system with multiple candidates of a given party. And also, people don't want to have to repeatedly go to the polls, so they just wait for those November elections because you got to spend not just time to research those candidates and mull over your choice, you actually have to go out to the polls. And for some people, that is not necessarily a simple task. Now, for me, I just have to go a few blocks to my polling place and I'm there. People don't necessarily have that, especially if they're in a rural area. They have to spend all that time to go out there. They might not have an easy means of transportation to get to those polling places. So it may not just be they don't really want to put the effort in to go to those polls. It might be just much more difficult for them to make it to those polls. So next category, we'll talk about general elections in November versus other months. Now, I had an episode early on, the second episode, I believe, that was talking about election timing and a general election that is held in November, how that differs in turnout from a general election in, say, May or June. Turnout dips for these non-November general elections compared to November because many people don't know that they're happening. They're typically local level offices, which voters care less about compared to state and federal offices. People just don't care as much about them in general, even if they wanted to find, or even if, regardless of trying to find or having to spend the time to find this information, they just don't care as much about them. And again, people don't want to have to repeatedly go to the polls, so they just wait for those November elections sometimes. Next category, presidential versus midterm versus odd year versus special elections. So, presidential elections every 4 years. We've got one this year in 2024, then in 2028, 2032. Midterms are just like they sound, they're in the middle of these presidential terms. So, 2024 is the upcoming presidential election. 2026 is the next midterm election. Then the next one of that will be 2030, then 2034. Odd year elections are in odd numbered years. So 2031, 2033, 2027, and then special elections, which are by definition unusual and therefore turnout can be all over the place. We'll get to that in just a moment. But presidential elections get the highest turnout because that's when the president is up and that's what people care most about. Then it's followed by midterms, and then that's typically followed by odd year elections. And with special elections, because they're irregularly scheduled, turnout can be all over the place. But generally, special elections have the lowest turnout out of that group of presidential, midterm, odd year, special elections. Special elections will tend to be the lowest. Turnout dips in these elections typically because people care about them less than presidential elections. They don't know that they're going on, especially with those special elections. You have to let people know, oh, by the way, this election here, and for those who don't know, special elections are when an office is vacated for the candidate or the office holder might have died, they might have resigned. It could, for whatever reason, the office has become vacant before a regularly scheduled election. So if it's a 2-year term, for example, and the office holder resigns a year into it, then they have to call a special election. So you have to then let people know, oh, by the way, there's actually an election for this office that doesn't normally happen at this time of year. So then you got to get people to care about that and get them to go out to the polls to research these candidates. So people don't necessarily know they're going on. A lot of people don't even know that there's odd year elections, and those are typically local level offices. So people tend to care about local level again. They tend to care about the local level a lot less than the state, and then care about both of those less than the federal level. And there's less media coverage and information available on them, generally speaking. And once again, people think that the president has more impact and authority over things than is actually the case. So they don't concern themselves as much as with these other elections, or they don't want to have to spend the time again to go out to these elections for the special election. The special election, a lot of times, that's the only election that's happening on that day. Not always, but a lot of times that is the case. So then you've got to spend the time to go out just for that one contest. A lot of people don't want to do that. Next group we'll talk about is a little bit different. Instead of the types of elections, more about the types of voters. So we're talking about party affiliation and strength of partisan ties. So if we break it down into Republicans versus Democrats versus independents, Republicans generally turn out more than Democrats. Democrats, their demographics are ones that tend to vote less often, but both parties turn out a lot more than independents do, generally speaking. And then we have a difference between quote unquote strong partisans and quote unquote weak partisans. That's not a value judgment, but it's an indication of how much they identify with their political party. You might have a strong Republican who has 50 bumper stickers on their car. They let you know at their house that they're Republican. They wear campaign paraphernalia, or same thing with Democrats. They might do the same thing. Those are what we would call strong partisans. They're very active in their party's politics. They might go to their local party's meetings all the time. And then you have the weak partisans that are kind of like, yeah, I'm a Republican. Yeah, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not so heavily involved. Just let me know when these elections are happening, that kind of thing. So again, it's not trying to say somebody's a true Republican or true Democrat, or they're they're weak as a value judgment. It's just a way to describe how strongly they affiliate with their party. Now, turnout dips for these independents and these quote unquote weak partisans because a stronger tie to a party affiliation means more vested interest to vote. You might see, or they often see, an existential threat if they lose or if their candidates lose. So they feel that they have to do their sworn duty and vote not just for their party, but vote against the other party. And stronger partisans are just more politically active in general. They do phone banks, they go door to door. They not only are researching candidates, or they've already made up their mind about their candidates and they're going to go vote, they're going to try to get other people to vote as well. Next group is the competitiveness of elections. More competitive elections tend to see higher turnout. If you have a US Senate seat that is possibly going to flip parties, if it's held by a Republican and there's a good chance a Democrat's going to take it, or it's held by a Democrat and there's a good chance Republicans going to take it, you often see these elections as higher turnout than you usually would have. Turnout dips in these less competitive elections because a lot of times some of these voters see no point in making a choice, especially if they are picking the uncompetitive option. It's like, well, if they're going to lose anyways, why am I even going to bother showing up? And then you might have the people who support the competitive option that don't really take the time to go out there and support that candidate because they say, well, they're gonna win anyways, so I don't really need to show up to vote. That's sometimes the line of thinking. In some places, if there's only one candidate in or one candidate for an office, that candidate is automatically declared the winner and the contest doesn't even appear on the ballot. Now, that's not very common. It happens in Florida for I'm not sure if it's for every office or I'm not sure how many offices that is the case for in Florida, but at least for Congress, if there is only one candidate in a general election, they're just declared the winner, and that's that. Candidates aren't necessarily making as strong of a push to get people to come out to vote. Maybe they don't have as much uh, funding because the local or state level parties aren't funding them because either A, they have no chance of winning, or B, it's a done deal. Why am I going to put money towards a candidate that is surely going to win because we only have so many resources to give to candidates. So they're going to try to give it to candidates that are in more competitive elections. And so you'll see a lot more advertising and pushes in those competitive elections to get people to come out to vote. And you'll see it less in those less competitive ones where people expect a candidate to win. Not always the case, but that's typically what you see. And then these bigger name offices are usually more competitive and people care about them more than those lesser known offices. Even for US Senate, you rarely see one party just say, you know what, we're not even going to bother running a candidate, for example. There's almost always going to be a candidate run, even if they have no shot of winning. The office is just too important in the grand scheme of things, or has too much of a widespread impact for people to say, we're not even going to run a candidate in it, for example. So those bigger name offices are usually going to see more competition. Now, just because you see both a Republican and a Democrat running for it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be competitive, but a lot of times it will have people trying much harder to win it than for a lower level office. Next group we're going to talk about is partisan versus nonpartisan offices. Usually, these partisan offices see higher turnout than nonpartisan offices, and that's because, for one, nonpartisan offices tend to be local level races, which, again, voters generally care less about than those state and federal level races. But the lack of a party identification is a heuristic many people use to cast their vote. Party identification is the strongest indicator of who a person is going to vote for. So, if it's a Republican voter and it's a Republican candidate in that general election, it's very likely that they're going to vote the Republican. Or if it's a Democrat, it's very likely they're going to vote for the Democratic candidate. And then these nonpartisan races also tend to be more obscure and require more specialized knowledge to adequately research these candidates, particularly judges. Now, not every judicial race is a nonpartisan race, but when it comes to the local level, they're almost always a nonpartisan office. So, obviously, with judges, more specialized knowledge of what exactly they do and what they rule on. So a lot of people will not it's not even that they don't care, it's that they think I don't know what to even look for, so I'm not even going to bother researching these candidates. And then for the last category we're going to talk about is elected offices versus ballot measures. Now, a lot of this depends on the office and the ballot measure in question. Some ballot measures are very highly publicized. We have several that relate to abortion this year, and they will get much higher participation than other ballot measures this year, and they'll get higher participation than a lot of these elected offices are going to get. And for certain ballot measures, voters who otherwise wouldn't show up to the polls may now come just to vote on that measure. Also, the typical placement of ballot measures lower on the ballot does also impact their turnout, but they can still, again, get more turnout than certain elected offices. So it's kind of hard to say this is typically why turnout dips for these ballot measures because some of them actually get much higher participation than other measures do, or they'll get more participation than local level offices or maybe even certain state level offices. might even approach the level of participation that we see in federal offices. It just depends on the office in question and the ballot measure in question. And then to end things off, we will talk about other impacts on voter turnout. So, effective emotions, anger and disgust, or anger slash disgust, and fear slash anxiety can have very powerful impacts on people. If people fear they have an existential threat or they perceive an existential threat from the quote unquote other side, they're going to be more likely to participate. If they're angry at somebody that's currently in office, they're going to be more likely to participate and try to vote them out of office, less so voting for somebody, more so voting against somebody. Different contests for uh, different contests on the same ballot can increase turnout for other races on that same ballot. So you might have a highly publicized and or highly emotionally charged contest that can increase turnout for not only that particular contest, like a mayor or president or U.S. Senate or governor. It might have a trickle down effect where it increases turnout for other races. And a lot of times you might see that in straight ticket voting, meaning person votes the same party for every single office that is a partisan level office. So a lot of Democrats will be voting not only against Donald Trump this year and voting for Kamala Harris, they will be voting for every other Democrat as sort of a way to punish Republican voters. Same thing with Republicans voting not only for Donald Trump, but trying to punish Kamala Harris and by proxy Joe Biden by voting Republican up and down the ticket. So you see this a lot with those straight ticket voters. Now some of them were going to do that anyways, but when it's an emotionally charged contest, it's charged enough with emotions in that contest. You'll see not only higher turnout for that contest, but you'll see it for other elections as well. And then the placement of contests on the same ballot is not just because of which of these contests have particularly high rates of media coverage or are a lot more emotional, but just in general, the placement of contests on the same ballot will impact how much participation there is. We have a phenomenon that we call ballot drop off, which it means the further down the ballot you go, the fewer the number of people are voting. So let's say in a polling place you have 1,000 people voting on president, and then there's 950 that are voting on U.S. Senates, and then then there's only 875 of those that are voting on U.S. House, and then there's an 850 that are voting on governor, and it gets down to a point where you're talking about county commissioners, and there's only 250 people voting on them, or there's a local ballot measure that's only getting like 200. It's a lot of it is not just because it's a local race or people care about it less, just the fact that it's lower on the ballot will have people participating in it less. Part of this phenomenon is the fact that the number of ballot or number of contests on the same ballot can lead to what we call ballot fatigue. So people just get tired of voting on a whole bunch of choices, so they'll eventually just stop, or they'll just take the ones that they specifically care about and vote for those. More time is also needed to research these offices. So if you have 15 contests versus 25 contests, you're going to probably see a lot more ballot drop off on the 25 contest ballot versus the one that has 15. A lot of these voters they're not necessarily even tired of voting, they just feel uncomfortable making a choice on those offices if they feel that they haven't had enough time to research them or know where to find this information. And then you have these bigger name offices that are higher up on the ballot, like president or governor, and these less publicized offices. So it kind of compounds on that level of trying to find information on these candidates or or how many of these voters even care about these lower level candidates as well. So you have a lot of these different factors all coming together to influence voter turnout. So a whole bunch of different things to consider when it comes to voter turnout, but we have seen a little bit like I said earlier, we've seen a little bit more turnouts past couple of times, partly because of Donald Trump. A lot of Republicans trying to support him, Democrats, a lot of them trying to go against him. Yeah, but you see, it's not just because of that. There's all sorts of other smaller things like certain other contests that might be highly emotionally charged as well. But that does it here for today's episode on voter turnout. Leave you once again with a random question. And today's random question is: do you use an Oxford comma? Now, for those who don't know what an Oxford comma is, whenever you have a group of three items that you're talking about. So if I say X, Y, and Z, so X, comma, Y, comma, and Z. The comma before the and is the Oxford comma. And I get irrationally upset when people do not use it. You need to differentiate that Y and Z are two different things, and the way you differentiate them is with an Oxford comma. Now, some people who are listening to this probably couldn't care less, but it's one of those trivial things that bothers me. There's a lot of trivial things that I get very annoyed about, and probably says a lot more about me than it does other people, but I don't know. Sometimes I like to find trivial things to get upset about as opposed to things that are actually upsetting. I like to it's a little bit cathartic for me. Uh so yeah, anytime I don't see an Oxford comma used, particularly in news headlines, that's the thing I think about a lot and I get very upset. I don't write anybody to say, "Hey, use the Oxford comma," but use the Oxford comma. Come on now. What are we doing here? But anyways, that's going to do it for this episode of Politics with Paul. Once again, thank you so much for listening. Find me on Facebook, Paul Rader, author and speaker. Also on LinkedIn and on Medium, writing about political science from a nonpartisan perspective, as always, just like I talk about it on here. And my website, paulrader.org. So once again, thank you for listening, and like, comment, and subscribe, and share with all your friends because I need attention. And I don't get enough attention. Please share this with people. Anyways, that's going to do it for this episode. So once again, thank you for listening. And until next time, take care.